few weeks ago, I sat in a high school auditorium watching a dress rehearsal for my granddaughter's dance recital. And I sat through some jazz and some hip-hop and some ballet and some tap dancing. And I must admit, my mind wandered just a little bit, and then suddenly there was a very haunting tune being played over the loudspeaker. And I looked up at the stage, and the performers were dancing slowly and with grace. And the tune was a wistful, sad tune. And then the words came to it, being repeated over and over. Everything changes. Everything changes. Everything changes. Wistful and sad. Indeed, I don't really need to spend much time today, do I, telling you that change happens every day, from day to day. In fact, other words for change might be life. It certainly is the word growth. But there is a change about change. And that is that change is happening faster and faster to us. Have you noticed that? It's accelerating through time. In fact, I can show that to you. Scientists tell us that we are the 800th generation of human beings, at least what can be called human beings. 800 generations of us. And the first 650 lived in caves. Only in the last 4 or 5 generations have we made use of electricity, and only the last 2 are proficient in computers and that technology. Change is happening faster and faster to us. In fact, someone said, just when you think you understand the situation, what you don't understand is that the situation just changed. Someone else said that the factories of the future will have only 2 employees, a person and a dog. And the person is there to feed the dog, and the dog is there to see that the person doesn't touch any of the equipment. I think it's a lesson that maybe Detroit has learned the hard way, as factories have changed enormously. So it is, we live in a world of change, and a world of very rapid change. So how do we respond to that kind of a life? How do we live day by day with the pressures of that kind of change? And some of the changes are good changes, and some are hard ones. We can be, as a 2-year-old, and make good use of the word no, and just say we don't believe that's happening. We can deny it. It's a very safe thing to do. That's why the word no is used so often by a 2-year-old. That's the safest thing they can do. The world is a scary place. And so we can react that way too. In fact, we can also go a step further and live in the past. And live with our memories. And the past is a great place to visit, but we can't really live there. But it's a safe place. Don't you see why it's safe? There are no changes in the past. You know what the ending is. It's like going to a movie several times. In fact, it's like the movie Groundhog Day. Some of you may have seen that 1993 movie with Bill Murray, and it was Groundhog Day, and the next day was Groundhog Day, and the next day exactly the same. Every day he experienced the same conversations, the same events. At first he was startled, and pretty soon he got angry. And pretty soon what you and I might think of as being a dream come true, to live one of our favorite days again, soon became a nightmare. Because he knew what was going to happen all day long. You might think that's safe because there's no change. But it becomes a nightmare, and it's a great place to visit. And it's a safe place. But that isn't what we can do. I sometimes think that people who do a lot of hoarding, that's what they're attempting to do, is to keep things somehow all gathered in and the same, and say no to change. That's not a place where we can be. The other thing that you might do when there's too much change happening around you is you might simply withdraw inside and somehow alter what that change is by the way you think and the way you look at it. You don't examine it and take it for exactly what it is. Instead, you withdraw inside and change it. And sometimes you do this unconsciously. And I can give you an example of the unconscious variety anyhow. Many of you know that I was 11 years old when my family moved to California. We left behind a very large, close family so that we returned to Illinois at least once a year, usually twice, and I think my mother went back a third time often. And for the first 7 or 8 years, I went back on all those visits. But I would return to California and I would say to my parents, you know, it wasn't a very happy time. They still treat me like I'm 11 years old. They talk to me that way. They exclude me from these certain things. They haven't noticed that I grew up. And it upset me for a while. And then as time went by, I eventually, in college and later, would return, usually on the way to someplace else. I would stop by. And I began to notice that there were illnesses, mental lapse. I think I didn't really change in my attitude until the deaths started occurring. And then I realized I had kept all of them the way they were when we left. I saw them in the same way. I didn't respond to the changes that were taking place in them, just as they kept me at age 11. Finally, we all caught up with each other, but it was a way of coping with the tremendous trauma of that change. Change in our lives when it was uprooted. We came to a new place, and we kept that place just the way it was, as if no change could happen, and they kept us the same way. So you can respond that way. You can say no, you can withdraw. But like all things, this is an opportunity for us to say, what does our Christian faith say to us? How does our Christian faith help us to meet the changes, good or difficult ones, that happen to us all the time and are happening faster and faster to us? Does our Christian faith have anything to say about it? You have all found those ways already, pretty much. And we could spend a long time today talking about all the ways in which you have discovered that your Christian faith maybe gives you some help with this. But I want to suggest 3 things today. 3 principles, if you will. In fact, I'm going to suggest that you meet change with a principled life. We don't talk very much about character and principles today, do we? But I'm going to suggest that that's the way to meet change. Because when you are principled, you have a solid place to stand. The old hymn, on this solid rock I stand, all other ground is sinking sand. You have, with your principles, a solid place to stand. A place that is stronger than any change. And a place that will fortify you with wisdom and courage to meet any change. That's pretty great. That's what our Christian faith can do. And what are the principles? I'm going to suggest just 3 of them. One is associated with God, and 2 with the life and teaching of Jesus. We have many words in which we describe what God is like. Spiritual center of the universe, creator and sustainer of all life, and many more that you have. We have to be careful we don't limit God by too many words and make it too small. But we have many words that describe God, and I'm only going to talk about one today, and that is our God is accessible. Think about that. When change comes, God is accessible. We need to be accessible to God. But God is always accessible to us. What an amazing thing. This spiritual center of the universe, this creator of all life, is sustainable, is accessible to each one of us. And if you've been in the adult class the last few weeks, you have heard some of the ways in which we are accessible to God. Prayer is the thing that probably comes to your mind first. But there are many, many others, and the class has been discussing them. But God is accessible to us. And that is a solid place to stand when change overwhelms you. The accessibility of God. And then two things from the life and teaching of Jesus. As a follower of Jesus, we are asked to make decisions not to save our own life. We're not to make decisions to try to avoid Gethsemane or Calvary. That's a tempting thing to do, isn't it? When the hard things happen, to make our decisions so to save our own life. But that wasn't the way Jesus lived, was it? He went to the cross for us. He went to the cross to say that love is stronger than death. Love is stronger than hate. And I will love from the cross. I will love always. And I will not act to save my life. I will not act to avoid Gethsemane. I have a good illustration for you for this. In 1923, the Summer Olympics were being held. And a young Scottish athlete was to run for England. He would later spend all of his life as a missionary to China. But in the year 1923, we have the Roaring Twenties. We have a period of time following World War I, following the world wars in the 20th century, were really periods of great social and political upheaval. And in England especially, which had lost a whole generation of young men. And so the church was becoming less relevant. And so when Eric Liddell was to run his final race in the Olympics for England for the gold medal, he learned that the race would be run on Sunday. You know the story. If you saw Chariots of Fire, that young man couldn't act to save his life. He said he couldn't do it. Now that seems archaic today, doesn't it? In a world that does everything on Sunday morning. But in 1923, that was not so easily accepted. And to a man of faith, as he was, he said that he had been given great gifts from God, and he needed one day to honor God. And if you saw the movie, there's a scene where the dignitaries from England come to the Olympics to convince him to run because he ran like the wind. And even the Prince of Wales was there. And he stood his ground. That was the point of the movie. He had a principle, a place to stand when the changes of society and politics swept after the war. He stood his ground. The second principle that we get from the life of Jesus is our recognition of our connection to one another and the principle of relating to one another with grace and joy and compassion, without a violence in our speech or in our actions. And the best example I have of this comes from a non-Christian. Could be no better example than the life of Gandhi. Again, after World War II, we find the world is in disruption. There's turmoil socially and politically. And India had been promised its independence after the war by England. So when the war ended, India was anxious for that independence. And England had every intention of doing that, but they were just a little more precise and a little slower about doing it. So Gandhi led the protests and the marches that were done all over India to hurry that process up. And it was nonviolent, all nonviolent. So you know the life of Gandhi, that was his central principle. And there came a time when one of the demonstrations found itself in kind of a courtyard, a circle, with a well in the middle. And as they marched through that, when they tried to go out the other side, they were blocked by British soldiers who had enough of this, is all you can say. They were chastised afterwards for what happened. But nevertheless, the soldiers opened fire on the group. They couldn't retreat. They wanted them to retreat, but the soldiers had blocked the other exits. So there were like 3 entrances to this circle with a well in the middle and no way out because the soldiers had blocked it. And most of the demonstrators were women and children. Those who weren't killed by the bullets leaped into the well to avoid it and drowned in the well. It was a massacre. And it absolutely ignited India. The country just blew up. And all of the Indians who had been following Gandhi so closely, anyone who could find a gun picked it up and tried to shoot as many British soldiers as they could kill. Gandhi was horrified. He pleaded with his aides to go out and tell them to stop. That the only way that something as good as their independence could be meaningful would be if they achieved it without any violence. And their aides said, they're not listening. They're not going to hear you this time. This was too much for anyone to bear. And Gandhi said, well, then I'm going to fast. I won't eat or drink until every gun is laid down. And the aides said, it's not going to work this time. They will not do that, and you will die. And Gandhi said, and then they will listen. Then they will hear me if I die. I will not act to save my life, and I will die. And then they will listen. Well, they did listen, but only barely before he did die from that. And he went on, and they went on to achieve their independence. But it's a principle that we have in our social life, our connections with each other. We should be without violent rhetoric and without violent actions. There's been no time when that is tested as much as it has been this past week. And I would urge all of us to follow the principle of loving, compassion, and caring for one another publicly, where we speak with compassion and act and love with compassion. Now, with a principled life, not only do you have a strong place to meet changes, but you will make changes from there too. You are involved in change. All this change that is happening isn't someone else's responsibility. We are making change too. And actually, the way in which you act will determine what changes are made. And I'm going to conclude with 2 illustrations of how you act and what the results are. First is a story of a very wise man who was known because he always could tell you what the truth was. He had a reputation for when you asked him any question, he could tell you the truth. A rare ability. And he was famous for it. But there were 2 teenage boys, and as 2 teenagers want to do, they decided to test him and maybe even embarrass him. So they went to him one day and said, we have a question for you. We know you will tell us the truth. And he said, yes, I will. And the one boy said, I have a bird in my hand. Is the bird dead or alive? And of course, if the man said the bird is dead, he would let him go. And if the wise man said the bird is alive, he would squeeze him, and the bird would be dead. So the wise man said, the truth about the bird today is up to you. The truth about the bird is up to you. It's up to you what changes are going to be made. It's up to you how this church moves now and how all of us move in a world of rapid change. And finally, this story, said to be true, about the painting of the Last Supper on a church in Milan. You're familiar with it. It's the last depiction that's made at the art festival in Laguna Beach every year. The very last picture that they show live is the Last Supper. It is a wonderful stained glass window of it at in Glendale with Forest One. Wonderful stained glass window. But when Leonardo da Vinci was painting it on the back of the church, it is a fresco, a church in Milan. As he began painting, he used people from the city of Milan for the models for his faces. And he did pretty well for a long time. We remember that picture is at a special moment at the Last Supper. It's the moment when Jesus says, "One of you will betray me." What a moment to freeze in time. One of you are going to betray me. And because that was the moment he took, the expressions on the faces were very important. It took him several years to make the painting, and he had several of the disciples done, and the two that were people in the painting that were really difficult for him was the picture of Jesus and of Judas. But soon into it, he was passing by the church one afternoon when the teenage boys came out from choir practice, and the light hit the face of this one young boy, and he said, that's the face of Jesus. He talked to the boy, and the boy agreed to be his model. So he had Jesus painted in. He had half of the disciples, and he continued on until he got the rest of the disciples, except for Judas. And he couldn't find anyone who represented a despicable enough nature that he would betray Jesus. Finally, he had an idea. He decided to go to the prisons. He thought surely there would be someone in one of the prisons who would give him that face. And he continued on, prison after prison. He wasn't having any luck. And then he thought, maybe I'm not asking the right question. Is there a dungeon? Is there a place that you put the people who are so bad they can't even be among the other prisoners? And so the guard said, well, we do have that, but I wouldn't advise you to go down there. He said, no, let me take a look. And of course he went. He looked in the different solitary confinement cells, and then he saw the face that he thought could represent Judas. They asked the man if he would agree to it, and he did. Leonardo, with a guard at his side, spent some hours in the cell sketching the face. And then he thanked the man and turned to leave. And as you would guess, the man said, I have modeled for you before. I was your model for the face of Jesus. But you see, in the passing years, he had developed changes. He had chosen, and what he chose came to look as he did. So it is that we have changes to make, and the changes and the decisions that we make based on principles, the principle of an accessible God, the principle that Jesus will not and we cannot lose our life in order to save it. We will not save it that way. And that when we act in public, we act with compassion and not violence. Let us pray.